The cathedral doors burst open in the middle of the funeral service, and the sound sliced through the quiet church like a gunshot. Every head turned instantly. At the front of St. Michael's Cathedral in Boston stood a polished mahogany coffin surrounded by white lilies and flickering candles holding the body of Sarah Collins, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher who had died only weeks after giving birth. Nearly 200 mourners filled the wooden pews dressed in black, their faces heavy with shock and grief. The priest had been speaking softly about heaven and eternal peace, but his voice faded into silence as two figures appeared in the doorway. The man entering the church was Sarah's husband, Daniel Collins. The woman holding his arm was not his wife. Daniel walked slowly down the aisle in a tailored charcoal suit that looked more appropriate for a corporate boardroom than a funeral. His posture was straight, confident, almost indifferent. Beside him walked Chloe Bennett, a 29-year-old associate from his investment firm, her sleek black dress and sharp heels echoing loudly against the cathedral's marble floor. The sound of those heels clicking through the sacred silence felt almost offensive, each step spreading whispers through the crowd like wildfire. People leaned toward one another, murmuring in disbelief, some lifting their phones discreetly as if they sensed something scandalous unfolding. Daniel did not hesitate or lower his head in shame. He simply walked forward with Chloe beside him, their hands loosely intertwined. 3 rows from the front, Megan Carter gripped a damp tissue in both hands, her chest tightening as she watched the scene unfold. Megan was 35, a young attorney and Sarah's closest friend for more than 2 decades. They had grown up together in a small West Virginia town where dreams rarely stretched beyond survival. Yet Sarah had always believed she was meant for something more. She worked tirelessly, earned a scholarship to Penn State University, and built a life in Boston that felt like proof that determination could rewrite destiny. Megan still remembered the phone call 8 months earlier, when Sarah had whispered excitedly that she was finally pregnant. That memory now collided painfully with the image of her friend lying silent in the coffin just a few feet away. Behind Megan, Sarah's mother, Linda Harper, released a shattered cry that echoed through the cathedral. Linda was 60 years old, small and tired after decades of working double shifts at a roadside diner, and she had driven all night from West Virginia to bury her only child. Seeing her son-in-law walk into the church holding another woman's hand broke whatever fragile strength she had left. Her legs gave out, and Megan barely caught her before she collapsed to the stone floor. Several guests rushed forward to help, their faces pale with shock, but Daniel never turned his head. He continued walking calmly until he reached the front row reserved for family members and sat beside Chloe only a few feet from Sarah's coffin. The priest stood frozen behind the pulpit as silence swallowed the room. Then a silver-haired man slowly rose from one of the side pews and walked toward the podium. Thomas Whitmore, a respected estate attorney in his late 50s, adjusted his glasses and surveyed the stunned congregation before speaking. His voice was calm, steady, and carried easily through the cathedral. Before this service concludes, he announced, "I have been instructed by Sarah Collins to read her final will and testament here today." A ripple of confusion spread across the mourners. Whitmore held up a sealed envelope and paused deliberately. Sarah requested that these instructions be heard by everyone she loved. His eyes shifted briefly toward Daniel. And everyone who betrayed her. The silence inside St. Michael's Cathedral deepened after Thomas Whitmore finished his announcement. The priest stepped aside from the pulpit without protest, his earlier sermon about peace and heaven now forgotten. All attention shifted to the silver-haired attorney standing calmly at the front of the church with the sealed envelope in his hand. 200 pairs of eyes followed his every movement as he slowly broke the wax seal. The faint crack of the paper sounded strangely loud in the cathedral. Daniel Collins shifted in his seat beside Chloe Bennett, irritation flickering across his face as if this interruption were nothing more than an inconvenience. To him, the funeral had already been a tiresome obligation. Now it was turning into something else entirely. Whitmore unfolded several sheets of paper with deliberate precision before speaking again. His voice was smooth and controlled, carrying easily through the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral. I, Sarah Elizabeth Collins, being of sound mind and judgment, do declare this document to be my final will and testament. A quiet murmur passed through the crowd. Most people assumed the document would simply confirm what everyone expected. Daniel, as the grieving husband, would inherit everything his wife had owned. The house, the savings, whatever small assets a school teacher might have accumulated over the years. Daniel himself leaned back slightly in his seat, crossing one leg over the other as though the matter had already been decided. But Whitmore did not rush. Instead, he scanned the room slowly, letting the tension build like a tightening wire. Megan Carter watched from the third row, her heart beating harder with every second. She had visited Whitmore's office 3 days earlier, summoned there without explanation. What she had learned during that meeting had shaken everything she thought she knew about her best friend. Sarah Collins had not been the quiet, harmless schoolteacher that Daniel believed her to be. Not even close. As Megan watched Whitmore standing calmly beside the coffin, she realized the moment Sarah had prepared for was finally arriving. Whitmore continued reading. To my daughter Grace Collins, I leave all my shares, assets, and controlling interests in Bright Mind Education, a company which I founded and have operated for the past 6 years. The words hung in the air for a moment before the shock truly registered. Confusion spread through the crowd like ripples across water. Bright Mind Education. The name was familiar to many people in the room. It was one of the fastest-growing online education platforms in the country, used by thousands of teachers across the United States. Daniel straightened suddenly in his seat, his expression shifting from boredom to disbelief. Whitmore looked directly at him before continuing. At the time of my passing, Bright Mind Education was independently valued at $52 million. The cathedral erupted with gasps. Daniel's face turned pale as the number echoed through the room. $52 million. Chloe Bennett's perfectly composed expression shattered beside him as her fingers tightened around his arm. That is impossible, Daniel muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. She sells teaching worksheets online. That little hobby makes maybe $200 a month. Whitmore paused, allowing the shock to settle before delivering the next line. Bright Mind Education was incorporated prior to my marriage and is protected under an irrevocable trust structure. Therefore, my husband, Daniel Collins, holds absolutely no legal claim to the company or its assets. The murmurs exploded into open whispers now. Daniel shot to his feet, fury rising in his voice. That is ridiculous. She hid that from me. That has to be illegal. Whitmore's calm expression did not change. On the contrary, Mr. Collins, it is entirely legal. Sarah Collins built her company long before she married you. Every contract, tax record, and financial statement proving that fact is properly documented. Daniel's confident mask began to crack in front of everyone. Chloe slowly removed her hand from his arm as if realizing she had suddenly attached herself to the wrong future. Megan Carter watched quietly from her seat as the first pieces of Sarah's carefully designed plan began to fall into place, and Whitmore had only just begun reading. For several long seconds after the number was spoken, the cathedral felt as if the air itself had frozen. $52 million. The words hung above the mourners like a thunderclap that refused to fade. Daniel Collins stood rigid beside the front pew, his face pale and tight with disbelief, while whispers spread across the rows behind him. Chloe Bennett's confident posture collapsed into stiff silence as she slowly released her grip on Daniel's arm. Only moments earlier, she had walked proudly into the church as the mistress of a wealthy man. Now the ground beneath that illusion was cracking open. At the center of it all, Thomas Whitmore remained perfectly calm, the sealed documents still resting in his steady hands. Megan Carter watched everything unfold from her seat with a strange mixture of sorrow and grim understanding. 3 days earlier, she had sat inside Whitmore's quiet office overlooking the Boston harbor, listening as the attorney carefully explained the truth about Sarah's life. The information had stunned her so deeply she could barely speak. For years, Megan had believed she knew her best friend completely. She knew about Sarah's students, her love of gardening, her dream of raising a family. But the woman Megan thought she understood had been quietly building something far greater in the background of her ordinary life. Something powerful. Something Daniel Collins had never even suspected existed. 6 years earlier, shortly after discovering Daniel's gambling debt, Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting her husband with anger, she began to build something of her own. What started as a simple online marketplace for lesson plans slowly grew into Bright Mind Education, a digital platform where teachers across the country could buy and share educational resources. Sarah worked late nights after grading papers, coding new features, negotiating partnerships with school districts, and studying business law through online courses. While Daniel assumed she was simply preparing classroom worksheets, Sarah was laying the foundation for a company that would eventually serve hundreds of thousands of educators. The irony was almost painful. Daniel Collins had spent years believing himself to be the powerful one in the marriage. He was the investment analyst with the expensive suits and the impressive salary. He was the man who came home talking about market strategies and corporate acquisitions while Sarah listened quietly across the dinner table. He had laughed when she first mentioned her online teaching store, patting her shoulder with amused condescension. "That little hobby of yours is adorable," he once told her. "Maybe one day it will pay for a vacation." Sarah had simply smiled and returned to her laptop after he went to sleep. Whitmore's voice pulled Megan back to the present. As stipulated in the trust documentation, Bright Mind Education and all associated assets are to be transferred directly to Sarah Collins's daughter, Grace Collins. The funds will be held in a protected trust until Grace reaches the age of 25. Megan Carter will serve as trustee and legal guardian of the estate. The announcement landed like a second shockwave. Megan felt the eyes of several guests turn toward her in surprise, but she did not move. She had already promised Sarah she would accept the responsibility. Daniel's disbelief had begun to turn into something darker. His hands clenched at his sides as anger replaced confusion in his expression. "That is impossible," he snapped, stepping forward toward the podium. "My daughter is an infant. I am her father. That money belongs to my family." Whitmore raised a calm hand before Daniel could continue. "Mr. Collins, you should remain seated." The attorney's voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the room again, because the next portion of Sarah Collins' final statement will address that assumption directly. Daniel froze, his expression tightening as Whitmore slowly reached into his briefcase and removed a small black remote control. With a soft mechanical hum, a projection screen began lowering behind the coffin, descending from the cathedral ceiling, like the curtain before the final act of a play. The white screen settled into place behind Sarah's coffin as Whitmore turned toward the audience once more. At Sarah Collins's request, the remainder of her final statement will be delivered in her own words. The attorney pressed the button. The projector flickered to life, and a moment later, the face of the woman lying inside the coffin appeared on the screen behind them. The image flickered once before stabilizing, and suddenly Sarah Collins was looking down at the entire room from the projection screen behind her own coffin. A quiet gasp spread through the cathedral. She appeared thin and pale, sitting upright in what was clearly a hospital bed, soft sunlight filtering through a window behind her. The illness had drained the color from her face, yet her eyes burned with a calm intelligence that felt almost unsettling. She had brushed her hair neatly over one shoulder and was wearing a simple blue sweater, as if she were recording a message for a classroom rather than delivering the final statement of her life. When she spoke, her voice was weak but unmistakably steady. "Hello, Daniel," she said gently. "And Chloe, I imagine you both look very surprised right now." The silence inside the cathedral deepened until even the faint buzz of the projector could be heard. Daniel stood frozen in the front row, his mouth slightly open, his earlier confidence draining from his face. Chloe shifted uncomfortably beside him, her eyes darting between the screen and the crowd surrounding them. Sarah paused for a moment as if studying their reactions from beyond the grave, then allowed the faintest smile to appear on her lips. "I know exactly what you are thinking," she continued. "You are shocked about the company, of course, but give it a few minutes and you will convince yourselves that there must still be a way to claim it. A legal loophole, a technicality, some clever maneuver your expensive lawyers will find. People like you always believe the game is not over yet." Sarah leaned slightly closer toward the camera, her expression sharpening. "But the truth is much simpler. The game ended long before you ever realized you were playing it." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd as murmurs spread across the pews. Megan Carter felt a chill run through her chest. Even after everything she had learned about her friend, seeing Sarah speak like this felt almost surreal. The gentle school teacher who once spent hours crafting colorful reading exercises for third graders now spoke with the calm authority of someone delivering a verdict. Daniel Sarah continued, "I want to thank you. Without you, Bright Mind Education might never have existed." The room stirred again as Daniel stiffened. "When I discovered your gambling debt 6 years ago, it forced me to confront something important. I realized I could no longer trust the future of my life to someone else's decisions. So I began building something that belonged entirely to me. Every early morning before school, every late night after grading papers, every weekend, you thought I was simply catching up on lesson plans. I was building a company, and the entire time you never noticed." Chloe's face had begun to pale noticeably now. She glanced toward Daniel, but he did not look at her. His eyes were locked on the screen, anger simmering beneath the shock. Sarah's smile grew colder. "Of course, Daniel, you were very busy. Between your casino trips in Atlantic City and your long evenings with Chloe, you had little time left to pay attention to your wife." A stunned murmur swept through the church as the affair was openly spoken aloud for the first time. Chloe flinched as if struck. "I know about everything," Sarah continued calmly. "The hotels in Chicago, the conference trip in Miami that was not actually a conference, the necklace from Tiffany that cost $4,000 and was never meant for me." Daniel's face darkened with fury, but Sarah did not stop. "And Chloe, you really should have been more careful about posting photos online. Your social media account made it very easy for my investigator to confirm where you were and when." The word investigator echoed through the room like a spark dropped into dry grass. Several people leaned forward in their seats now, their earlier discomfort replaced by fascination. Sarah watched them through the camera with quiet patience. "When someone betrays you," she said softly, "you have two choices. You can collapse and accept the role of the victim. Or you can begin gathering information. I chose the second option." She paused briefly, her eyes settling once more on Daniel. "Over the past 6 years, I documented every lie, every hidden account, every suspicious transfer connected to your gambling debts, every message between you and Chloe. I stored everything carefully in case the day ever came when I would need it." Daniel's breathing had become noticeably heavier now, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face twitched. The crowd sensed the tension building like a coming storm. Then Sarah delivered the next sentence with devastating calm. "Which brings us to the question you asked a moment ago. Daniel, you said the money belongs to your family because Grace is your daughter." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly as she held the camera's gaze. "I'm afraid that assumption is incorrect." The moment Sarah spoke those words, the entire cathedral seemed to tilt into stunned silence. Daniel Collins stared at the screen as if he had misheard something impossible. Chloe Bennett slowly turned toward him, confusion spreading across her face. Behind them, the crowd leaned forward, drawn deeper into the unfolding storm. On the screen, Sarah remained calm, her pale fingers folded together in her lap, her voice steady despite the weakness in her body. "Daniel," she continued quietly, "I know that must sound shocking, but the truth is simple. Grace is not your biological daughter." The reaction inside the church exploded like thunder. Gasps echoed against the stone walls, and several people stood halfway from their seats in disbelief. Daniel's face turned an alarming shade of red as rage surged through him. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking across the cathedral. "You are insane." Sarah watched him through the camera with an almost sad patience. "Daniel, please sit down. The DNA test results have already been submitted to the court and attached to my will. You will find the documentation inside the envelope Mr. Whitmore is holding. Your lawyers can review it at their convenience." Daniel staggered back a step as if someone had physically struck him. Chloe slowly withdrew from his side, suddenly uncertain where she belonged in the disaster unfolding before them. Sarah's voice continued steady and controlled. 3 years ago, shortly after I discovered your first major gambling debt, I attended an educational conference in Seattle. It was there that I met someone who reminded me what kindness actually looks like. Someone who listened when I spoke. Someone who treated me like a partner instead of a possession. The room remained silent except for the quiet hum of the projector. "I never planned for anything to happen," Sarah continued softly, "but life is rarely as simple as we hope it will be." Megan Carter felt her throat tighten as she watched her friend on the screen. Sarah did not look proud or ashamed. She simply looked honest. "I made one mistake," Sarah said calmly, "one human moment during a time when my marriage had already become a lie. Months later, I discovered I was pregnant. I considered telling you the truth, Daniel. I truly did. But by that time, you were already planning your future with Chloe. The hotels, the gifts, the secret phone calls. I realized something important then. Grace deserved a life free from the chaos you were creating." Daniel's fists clenched so tightly the veins in his neck bulged. "You expect anyone here to believe this nonsense?" he shouted. Sarah tilted her head slightly, almost sympathetically. "I do not expect you to believe anything today, Daniel. The evidence will speak for itself. The man who is Grace's biological father has already been contacted by my attorney. Whether he chooses to be part of her life will be his decision. But legally speaking, you have no parental claim over my daughter." The crowd erupted again, this time louder, the whispers filling the cathedral like rising wind. Chloe took another small step away from Daniel, as if realizing she had attached herself to a collapsing building. Sarah allowed the noise to settle before continuing. "Now that we have addressed that matter," she said quietly, "there is one more subject we should discuss. Daniel, you always believed you were the smartest person in every room. That confidence allowed you to overlook something very important." She paused just long enough for the tension to tighten again. "While you were busy gambling away millions of dollars and secretly moving funds through offshore accounts, I was documenting everything." Bank statements appeared on the screen behind her, followed by records of wire transfers and betting slips. Each document flashed briefly before the next appeared. Every casino visit in Atlantic City, every suspicious transaction through shell companies, every dollar you embezzled from Morrison Financial to cover your losses. Daniel's confidence finally shattered completely. His breathing became uneven as panic replaced anger in his eyes. Sarah's voice remained calm, almost instructional. "Copies of these documents were delivered this morning to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By tomorrow afternoon, several investigators will likely be reviewing your financial history in great detail. A stunned silence swallowed the room once more. Daniel Collins stood motionless at the center of the catastrophe, his carefully constructed life collapsing piece by piece in front of 200 witnesses. And Sarah Collins, the quiet schoolteacher everyone once underestimated, was still not finished speaking. For a long moment after the documents flashed across the screen, Daniel Collins could not move. The confident investment analyst who had walked into the funeral with his mistress now looked like a man standing at the edge of a collapsing cliff. His breathing had grown shallow, his eyes darting from the screen to the crowd around him as the reality of Sarah's words began to settle. Behind him, whispers rippled through the cathedral like wind through dry leaves. 200 people were watching the slow destruction of a man who had believed himself untouchable. On the screen, Sarah Collins watched calmly, her expression neither cruel nor triumphant. It was simply patient. "Daniel," she continued softly, "I know what you are thinking right now. You are wondering whether this is some kind of bluff. Perhaps you believe the evidence is exaggerated or that your lawyers will somehow make it disappear. After all, that is how your life has worked for a very long time. Problems appeared and money made them vanish." She paused, allowing the silence to stretch across the cathedral before continuing. "But there is one thing you never understood about me. I do not bluff." A new set of documents appeared on the projection screen. This time the images were different. Email threads, transaction records, photographs of luxury hotel rooms and private meetings. Chloe Bennett stiffened immediately as she recognized her own name scattered across the files. Sarah's voice remained calm but sharpened slightly. "Chloe, I believe you deserve a moment of attention as well." The younger woman's composure cracked as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Sarah tilted her head gently toward the camera, as if addressing her directly across the distance of death. "When I first discovered the affair, I assumed you were simply someone who had made a selfish decision. It happens. People make mistakes. But as I began documenting Daniel's financial behavior, I discovered something far more interesting." Another image flashed onto the screen. This one showed a string of text messages. Chloe's hands began to tremble visibly now. "You see, Chloe, you were not simply Daniel's mistress. You were also quietly sending confidential financial information from his firm to one of his largest competitors." The murmurs in the cathedral grew louder as the audience began reading the messages appearing on the screen. Chloe's face drained of color as her own words appeared in bold text. "He is too arrogant to notice. I can forward the numbers after the board meeting tomorrow." The name of the rival executive appeared beneath the message. Sarah continued speaking with the calm tone of a teacher explaining a complicated lesson. "For the past year, you have been selling Daniel's insider information piece by piece. Payment records from digital transfers followed each message on the screen, each one carefully documented." Daniel slowly turned toward Chloe, disbelief twisting his face into something ugly and desperate. "You were spying on me," he demanded hoarsely. Chloe's lips parted as she tried to speak, but no explanation came. Sarah's quiet voice cut through the tension again. Chloe was not the only one playing a dangerous game, Daniel. She was simply better at it than you were. A ripple of shocked laughter passed through the back rows of the cathedral. On the screen, Sarah leaned slightly closer to the camera. By the time this video is played, those same files will already be in the hands of federal investigators. Daniel's embezzlement charges will likely interest them. Chloe's insider trading activities will interest them even more. Two police officers standing quietly near the back of the cathedral shifted their stance as if anticipating what was coming next. Daniel's carefully constructed world was collapsing faster now, the pieces falling with increasing speed. Sarah's voice softened again, almost reflective. "For many years you believed you were the one in control, Daniel. You believed your money, your confidence, and your family connections made you untouchable. You looked at your quiet wife and saw someone small, someone harmless, someone who depended on you for everything. The faintest smile appeared on her face once more. That misunderstanding was your greatest mistake. The cathedral remained frozen in tense silence as Sarah's final words in that moment echoed through the room. Still waters run deep, Daniel. And sometimes they are hiding a storm you never see coming. The moment Sarah's voice faded from the speakers, the silence inside St. Michael's Cathedral lasted only a few seconds before reality came crashing down on everyone present. 2 uniformed police officers who had been standing quietly near the back of the church began moving down the aisle with calm determination. Their footsteps echoed sharply across the marble floor as the crowd parted instinctively to make way. Daniel Collins seemed frozen in place, his once immaculate confidence shattered into something fragile and desperate. Chloe Bennett stood beside him, trembling her eyes wide with the realization that the carefully constructed future she had imagined was collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses. Detective Laura Martinez, a seasoned investigator from the Boston Financial Crimes Unit, stepped forward beside the officers with a folder tucked beneath her arm. She had been invited quietly by Thomas Whitmore days earlier after reviewing the evidence Sarah had collected during the final years of her life. Her expression remained professional and composed as she approached the front row. "Mr. Collins," she said calmly, "you are being detained pending investigation into multiple counts of financial fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion." Daniel blinked at her in disbelief as though the words were spoken in a foreign language. "This is absurd," he snapped, trying to regain control of the moment. "You cannot arrest someone based on a video at a funeral." Detective Martinez did not raise her voice. "Mr. Collins, the evidence presented today is only a fraction of the documentation already delivered to federal authorities this morning. I suggest you cooperate." One of the officers stepped forward and gently but firmly guided Daniel's hands behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly through the cathedral, sending another ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. Chloe Bennett watched in horror as Daniel was restrained only a few feet away from the coffin of the woman she had helped betray. For a moment she seemed ready to flee down the aisle, but the detective's eyes shifted toward her next. Ms. Bennett Martinez continued calmly, "You will also need to come with us. There are several questions regarding insider trading and the illegal distribution of corporate information." Chloe's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. Tears streaked down her face as she tried to protest. "I did not know anything about his crimes," she insisted desperately. "I was just trying to protect myself." Several people in the audience quietly laughed at the irony. The same ambition that had led Chloe into Daniel's life had now dragged her straight into the consequences of his downfall. The officers escorted both of them down the center aisle past the rows of stunned mourners who watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. Just 30 minutes earlier, Daniel Collins had walked proudly through those doors as a powerful man accompanied by his glamorous mistress. Now he was leaving the same building in handcuffs. Megan Carter remained seated quietly as the chaos unfolded around her. She did not feel the triumphant satisfaction many people in the crowd seemed to experience. Instead, she felt something quieter and deeper, a sense of awe toward the friend she had known since childhood. Sarah Collins had been underestimated her entire life. The girl from a poor Appalachian town who studied late into the night while her mother worked endless shifts at a roadside diner. The young teacher who smiled politely when wealthy parents spoke down to her. The quiet wife who listened while her husband explained the world as if she were incapable of understanding it. Yet for 6 years, Sarah had been preparing for this exact moment with patience that bordered on brilliance. She had gathered documents, preserved evidence, and built a company worth more than most of the people in that cathedral would ever earn in their lifetimes. She had protected her daughter's future long before the storm arrived. Even in death, she had orchestrated a truth so powerful that it destroyed the people who believed they had destroyed her. Thomas Whitmore stepped forward again once the officers had escorted Daniel and Chloe outside. The attorney allowed the room a few moments to settle before speaking quietly. "Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the final statement of Sarah Collins." The crowd remained silent now, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavy respect that seemed to settle over the entire church. Megan finally rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the coffin at the front of the cathedral. She placed her hand gently on the polished wood, her eyes filling with quiet tears. "You did it, Sarah," she whispered under her breath. Every last one of them watched. Behind her, sunlight filtered through the tall stained glass windows, casting colors across the coffin like a final blessing. Sarah Collins had been dismissed as weak, overlooked as ordinary, and betrayed by the people closest to her. But in the end, she had proven something the entire room would remember long after that day. Never underestimate a quiet woman. 1 year passed after the funeral that changed everything. Life did not move quickly in the months that followed, but it moved steadily like a river finding its way forward after a violent storm. Megan Carter often thought about that day inside St. Michael's Cathedral, the moment when the entire truth had burst into the open and the lies surrounding Sarah Collins had collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. The newspapers had covered the scandal for weeks. Daniel Collins eventually faced trial on multiple federal charges and was sentenced to more than 20 years in prison for financial fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Chloe Bennett received a slightly shorter sentence after cooperating with investigators, though the public humiliation she endured was almost as devastating as the legal consequences. But the story did not end with their downfall. In many ways, it had only just begun. Megan now lived in a quiet brownstone apartment in Boston, a home that had slowly transformed into something far warmer than it once was. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, small picture books stacked neatly beside the couch, and sunlight poured through the windows each morning onto the soft blanket where a little girl liked to crawl. Grace Collins was now 1-year-old, bright-eyed, and endlessly curious about the world around her. She had her mother's dark eyes and the same thoughtful expression that once made Sarah pause before speaking. Sometimes when Megan looked at her, the resemblance was so strong it felt almost like Sarah had stepped back into the room for a moment. The responsibility of raising Grace had changed Megan's life in ways she never expected. The trust established through Bright Mind education ensured that Grace would grow up with security and opportunity. But Megan quickly discovered that money was not the most important gift Sarah had left behind. The true inheritance was the strength Sarah had shown during the final years of her life. That quiet determination had become a guiding force for everyone who loved her. Megan had even passed the bar examination and begun working as a financial attorney, motivated by the desire to protect others from the kind of betrayal Sarah had endured. On a warm afternoon in early spring, Megan prepared the small living room for Grace's first birthday celebration. Pink balloons floated near the ceiling and a simple banner stretched across the wall decorated with uneven letters that Megan's 8-year-old daughter Lily had proudly drawn herself. Only a few people gathered that day, but each one carried a piece of Sarah's memory with them. Linda Harper. Sarah's mother had traveled from West Virginia and now sat quietly near the window holding her granddaughter in her arms as tears of both sorrow and pride filled her eyes. Thomas Whitmore stood nearby with a gentle smile watching the child who had unknowingly inherited an empire her mother had built with extraordinary patience. After the cake was placed on the table and Grace's tiny hands smeared frosting across her cheeks, Megan rolled a small television toward the center of the room. Everyone grew quiet as she inserted a flash drive Whitmore had given her months earlier. Sarah had recorded several messages during the final weeks of her life, each one meant for Grace to watch during important moments. The first video began to play and Sarah's face appeared on the screen once again. She looked weak, but her eyes were warm and filled with love. "Happy first birthday, my beautiful girl," Sarah said softly. "If you are watching this, it means you are surrounded by people who love you very much. I wish more than anything that I could be there with you today. But if life has taught me anything, it is that love does not disappear just because someone is gone. It lives on in the choices we make and the courage we carry forward." Grace giggled at the sound of her mother's voice, unaware of the deeper meaning behind the words, but everyone else in the room felt the emotion settling quietly around them. Sarah continued speaking gently from the screen. "I built everything I could for you so that you would never have to depend on someone who might try to control your future. But the most important thing I hope you inherit is not the company or the money. It is the strength to know your own worth. Never allow anyone to convince you that you are small or powerless. Sometimes the quietest people are the ones who hold the greatest power inside them." The video ended, and the room remained silent for a moment, the weight of Sarah's words lingering softly in the air. Megan lifted Grace into her arms and looked around at the people gathered there. For the first time since the funeral, the feeling in her chest was not grief, but something steadier and stronger. Sarah Collins had been underestimated her entire life, yet she had proven something extraordinary before she left the world. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it waits patiently, quietly building until the moment it is needed most. And when that moment arrives, the truth can be stronger than anyone ever expected. From a broader perspective, stories like Sarah Collins's reveal something that psychologists, legal experts, and social researchers often observe in real-life: power is frequently misjudged. Society tends to measure strength through noise, wealth, or status, but the most transformative power is often quiet. Strategic patience, emotional discipline, and long-term thinking are the traits that truly reshape outcomes. Sarah was underestimated because she appeared gentle and ordinary, yet she understood something many people never learn. Preparation is power, information is protection, and dignity does not require loud revenge to deliver justice. Her story reminds us that resilience is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It grows quietly through small decisions, careful planning, and the courage to value your own worth. If this story resonated with you, consider supporting the channel with a like and subscribe, so more stories like this can reach people who need them. And before you go, leave a comment with 3 simple words that capture the lesson of today's story. Quiet strength wins.